I'm Ren,
And I'm Don.
and this is Books Insight, where hopefully you'll get a little bit of insight into books. Okie dokie. So today, without further ado, we're going to be discussing books that we think you really ought to read, we really recommend, but that might not be the first ones that come to mind when you think of 100 books you should read before you die, and that are a little bit more advised by our own, I think, taste and just experience with reading in general.
Get your dictionary out,
Ooh,
which
that's a
is
much more cheerful one.
one of the books I would like to recommend.
Well, I was going to say, so let's get into that. So why don't you go first with your dictionary?
Okay, I think everybody should have a very good dictionary.
Hmm.
And people are probably tempted to say, I could find anything you can have in there online. I'd go, and you'll get that one simple thing in miniature, form. You might be able to elaborate it further if you want to, but then you'll be done. Whereas with this book, you find your way to the word you want. You might get stopped on the way by noticing something before you get there, or at least all around that word, like how rowdy.
Hmm.
How rowdy is a Scottish word, a dish of boiled chicken. And I go, okay, that's interesting. And then you could look around there, hoyden, a tomboy. That's not in use anymore, but it's a cool, good that there is such a word. Anyway, Hubble's constant to do with astronomy. There's all kinds of stuff you'll just stumble on if you'll allow yourself to dawdle a little bit inside a dictionary.
It's funny you say that because this is totally not one of the books I was really going to talk about, and I'll only mention it because you said that. But it's a backing up of that idea. So, and I literally happened. Don't ask me why, but I happen to have it right here. The last of the really great Wang Doodles.
Oh yeah, I
That's
remember that.
her inspiration for this, she claims,
Oh,
Julie Andrews, because she says in the introduction to this book that, and it comes up in the story, that Wang Doodle is a word in the dictionary. And it's
okay.
just described as like a mythical creature, but that she only knew about that because of like skimming through the dictionary or something like that. And that idea, she found that word in the dictionary and thought that was so interesting how vague it was. There's just like, oh, it's like a mythical creature of some kind,
Kind
but
of
they don't
led
even.
to her book ultimately.
Yeah, exactly. That was why. Because so she and her, I think she met talks about how she and her siblings like talked about this, or they had some idea about this, or it stuck with her. I'm kind of mixing it up with the story a little bit, but that's what happens in the story as well, is that they're told to look this up in the dictionary.
Okay, well, that's cool. Well, I'm sure that would, be a likely outcome of having actually happened to say that's going
Yeah.
to go right into the book because it's really useful to have
Yeah.
people.
That's a great place to start, actually, the dictionary. I use that in my classes for teaching English all the time, like because I say the same to my students, like once because the bulk of the students that I work with are what would be considered to be kind of like intermediate level, and so I told them I was like at this point relying solely on translation to help you with unknown words is probably holding you back a little bit. So what I encourage them to do in class, and we do this sometimes together, is when we read a text about something, I'll tell them like, okay, circle all the words or expressions that you don't understand. And then I'll put them in groups and then they try to fill in those gaps together. Like maybe this person knows that word and they can explain it to the other one or and vice versa. But if they get down to ones that none of the people at the table know, I'll say, okay, look, go get a dictionary. And then I want you to look that word up and read the definition. And if there's a word in the definition you don't understand, you need to look that up. And then eventually you'll make it back to the original one. But the reason I think that's important is because not always, but sometimes the words you get stuck on in a text are not common words, but the words in the definition for that word probably would be, right? So, like, maybe you don't need to know the word. This is sort of a silly example for this level of uh, language learning I'm talking about. But for example, you don't necessarily need to know the word malevolent, but you should know the word evil, right? And so if evil is the thing that's in the definition and then you had to look that up, it's good that you had to look that up because that's a word you should be using. You should know that. And then if you already knew evil, then you can like level up that word and say like, oh, and I also know malevolent now. And a
Right?
good dictionary, like would tell you that mal is this prefix for bad. And then you
Right.
can take that and kind of have it paid forward when you see other words that start like that. So
Very good. Yeah,
I
you're
totally agree
good
with you.
language. tutor instructor. Yeah.
Well, but I think it's, I take your point, but I think it's good for anybody to do that, right? Like, I think
Yeah.
even as a native English speaker or native speaker of whatever language, looking through your dictionary is a
Right.
cool exercise just in general.
It's true. I happen to like words, and I
Hmm.
have fun with the more bizarre and complicated words
Yeah.
and what funny meanings and all that. But it doesn't have to be. It doesn't translate into like I want to become pretentious and say malevolent instead of evil. It just means this is a storehouse of the whole
Hmm.
goddamn language. And it's not that you will read the dictionary and learn everything, but it's a tremendous resource
Hmm. No,
for
I 1,000%
everybody.
agree.
Yeah.
My first one has nothing to do with that, but I will go with mine that is, I guess we'll discuss. I don't know. I wouldn't consider this nonfiction exactly, but it's different than all the other ones that I picked in the sense that it's not like a straightforward novel. But I went with Plato's The Symposium
Oh, okay.
for a couple of reasons. One, because I think, and I say this as a person who feels this way, that philosophy can feel very unapproachable as a subject, because I think a lot of philosophical texts, especially older ones, are unapproachable when it comes to how they're written and how dense they are and
Oh, yeah.
how intertwined they are as well, where it's like, oh, I thought I could just sit down and read this, but wait a second, I need to understand this theory that they're referencing from this other person who I haven't read. And
Yeah.
it's
Right.
just all
Right.
very tangled up. And I think that this is far enough back that even though it obviously is contextualized by other texts, it's like you can still read this on its own without having to have much other background knowledge and
Yeah. That's a really
follow
good
along.
choice. Really good choice. I actually thought about Plato
Oh,
as sort of I don't know if you know, self-explanatory, like
yeah.
because it's like a drama or like a play,
Yeah.
it's not like somebody just going paragraph after paragraph of dense. I thought there was a cat there, shadow. Um, yeah, the fact that it's done in a dramatic style
Hmm.
allows you to just like having a conversation,
Yes.
eavesdropping on a conversation, and it's not going to be like the density of reading Kant or somebody like that, where it's just like, what the heck?
Yes. Or
Yeah,
even something like Nietzsche. I think Nietzsche is also very dense. If you just sit down, even though his sections in some of his works are shorter, they're
yeah,
so dense compared to, I think, unless you already have read a lot of philosophy, even I think something like that, which is considered kind of like a gateway into philosophy, I still think would be a little bit harder to get into than something like this. And as well, I picked this symposium specifically, A, because I've read it, and B, because I think the topic that they're discussing, like what is love?
yeah, yeah.
Anyway, so like that topic, like I think is very accessible. And the way they're discussing it as well, I think is a good primer for how to think about philosophy of other subjects, because
Very
it
good,
is such
very
a,
good suggestion, I think.
yeah. And I also, the third reason that I like this one as a choice is because because as you know, like I've read a lot of what I would consider the queer historical canon, and this is referenced so much in a lot of other queer fiction, especially up to like the middle of the 20th century, that just like as shorthand, especially within those books, like it's referenced in Maurice by Ian Forster, like it's referenced by Oscar Wilde, not in his novel, like not in The Picture of Dorian Gray or his short stories, but in his essays and just in his other works that he's done. And just a lot of queer authors from like the Victorian and like mid to mid 20th century period reference this. That I just, if you're going to be reading any of those things, I think this is a good foundation text. Because the only thing that I remember specifically that this references that would also match into that is the Iliad. So it's like, okay, you could go read that, but it doesn't really matter to be able to understand this because it's just in one moment that they're referencing that. But you could then go off and that could be like another thing you could read, but it's just one.
Okay, a
Um,
couple of questions.
yeah.
In my memory, one of the participants is a woman in this.
Oh,
Is that
yes
right?
and no. So
Yeah.
like no in the sense that she is not present. So the story is that like they're all having this, they're at this party and Socrates is there as kind of like the star of the party. And so they each go around in a circle talking about what they think love is and like philosophizing about love. And he references a story where he spoke to a woman. Like
Okay.
that's what you're thinking of.
Maybe, okay. And then the other question is that the source of the reference that's in the back of my mind somewhere about Tiresias was a person
Mm-hmm.
who apparently was transformed. This came up because we were talking about Orlando the other day.
Mm-hmm.
Tiresias was from some story or some source was somehow transformed into a woman and then back again later. And then somebody asked him, which is not a real philosophical question, sort of like, who has a better time in sex?
Oh,
He said women or
I
something.
can't
The
remember if that
only person
specifically.
who's had the opportunity to be both or something like that. I thought that might have been from this book, but I can't remember.
I don't know if that's specific. I can't remember if that story sounds familiar, but I don't know if it's from this. But they do talk about one of the people talks about this origin story of the two sexes. Maybe
Oh,
there's a
okay,
little
okay,
crossover
yeah.
there.
Is that the
Maybe
one
that's
where they're like a broken in two thing
yeah.
that
And they
became
talk
one
about how
woman?
there were three. Yeah, so he talks about how there were three original types, and
Oh,
like
okay.
the one that was so like sometimes like the two that were masculine will go together and the two that were feminine will go together, but then there was this androgynous one, and that's like straight people. So like the man and the woman have to find each other, and that's the middle
Okay,
one.
okay. Oh, that's
Mm.
cool. I didn't realize he went into that.
Yeah. So I mean, as you can see, fascinating because that's just one approach that one person takes to explaining love and describing
Yeah,
it. And
yeah.
I also like this one just on a personal note because I really appreciate the the scene at the end where Alcibiades crashes the party wearing a flower crown and just like causes mayhem and disrupts everything. And I just like on a story and plot line level, I really appreciate that. And I thought that was funny and then whimsical and cute. So anyway, that was my first recommendation
Very
for
good.
those
Very good
reasons.
choice. I like it. Um, okay. On a lightweight note,
Ooh, I
children's book,
remember that one.
When the Sky is Like Lace. Barbara Cooney's the illustrator, who's very, very good. And the
Mhm.
author, I never seem to remember, Elinor Lander Horwitz. But what's cool about it is um, it's not teaching a lesson. It's simply fun. Kaboom! And everything is strange, splendid, and plum purple. So anyway, it's just so imaginative that I'm not going to try to read it or anything, but I just think people should look for this and enjoy it, whatever age you are. And if you have
Mhm.
children, I think you'll find it's very magical for children.
I really liked it as a kid a lot, if that's any kind of uh, accolade for it.
Well, good.
Isn't that the one where I feel like there's a scene in this where there are otters dancing and something to do with spaghetti, like eating
there's
spaghetti?
there's a yeah there's all kinds of silly stuff happens in it. Like I think the otters were ridiculing the snails or something like that. Otters only know one song, which is rather nasty. They sing it to the tune of the Mexican hat dance, but you can sing it to any tune you like. It goes like this. Oh, all snails look just like each other. Can you tell anyone from another? Little brother is just like his sister. Who could ever tell Mrs. from Mr.? And then you get the reaction of the snails being ridiculed. Here's the snails. Whoops.
Oh yeah.
And then this insults the snails, of course. Each snail believes that he is quite different from all other snails, very much himself. So when the otters sing their nasty song on bimulous nights, the snails usually sulk under the cinnamon bush until the moon is high, and then they line up two by two and march down to the grove to watch the trees dance. And it's just so beautifully fantasy-like.
It's a very
Silly.
whimsical book. Yeah, it's like silly, but very whimsical. I agree. And the color palette, even the idea like the sky is like lace, is
Right.
sort of surrealistic because like what does that mean exactly? And yet
Yeah.
you get a really strong sense after you've gone through the book what that means, even if
Right.
you couldn't
You might
explain.
look at the skies one day and say, wow. And she actually, speaking of obelist being a made
Hmm,
up word, bimulus, I'm pretty sure is a made up word,
I
but
was
it
gonna.
has that flavor like Lewis Carroll or something where you go, I feel a meaning, you know.
Mhm. I've
So
actually gotten more into picture books recently as an adult. Like there was a really big gap where I didn't care about them at all, but I've started going back to some of the ones that I really liked. And I, to your credit and to Mom's credit, I think you guys did a really good job curating our collection of picture books because like that one is very iconic to me. Rotten Island is very iconic to me. Who is the artist for that? He's very famous.
I think it's a writer artist, William Steig, I'm
Yes.
pretty sure.
Yeah, very iconic, like in terms of artwork and plot and story. Jennifer's
That's
Rabbit, I remember mom singing, like very vividly remember, like just a very good slew of picture books. Is Roxaboxen the name of the book?
Oh yeah,
Is
actually
that the
that's another one, same illustrator as this one, Barbara Cooney.
there you
Yeah,
go.
that's a good, very good story too. I like that.
Yeah. So another very good, solid
I'm at
recommendation.
the library now, not at the bookstore anymore, but we have a children's department, so I get to see a lot of
Mhm.
cool things, and they are arresting, and they're just some of them are just great for anybody. That's why I'm throwing it into the mix for what we're talking about.
I think that's a really good recommendation, actually, to add into the mix. My next one, I guess if we're sticking with whimsical, this is the only other one I have that would maybe fall into that category. And you won't be surprised because I will never stop talking about this book series. I think it's just perfect. The Amulet of Samarkand by
Oh
Jonathan
yeah,
Stroud,
oh yeah,
the Bartimaeus trilogy.
yes.
I tried to get into one of his other books that wasn't part of the Bartimaeus trilogy, and it just didn't hit the same notes for me. It wasn't bad, but like I just something about this series, it was just so perfectly executed, perfectly constructed. There was
I
so much
agree.
thought
Yeah.
put into this. So for the uninitiated, I think part of the reason I'm bringing this up is because I will bring this up at the slightest provocation, but also specifically because I feel like it deserved better than it got in terms of
Yeah,
reception.
I
Like
agree. That's really brilliant, brilliant, brilliant series.
it's such a good series. I think it's a really good. So not only do I think that it is perfect in the sense of what it is, which is a young adult fantasy series. I think that sometimes there's this tendency for critics or just people in general, if the series is very good, to say like, oh, maybe this really shouldn't be YA, as though YA can't be good. You know what I mean?
Yeah, right.
And like it's better than that. Like this is actually really for adults. And I'm like, no, I think this is a really good example of a story that was very much aimed at the audience that it was for. So this is very much a YA series in its essence, in terms of the ages of the characters and in terms of the complexity of the ideas and like the relevance of those ideas to the readership, I think. I mean, he has those like sort of awkward, like that's probably the weakest part of the series, but like the awkward sort of like teenage romance stuff that happens in this, whatever. But the plotting of this in terms of what is this about, like the idea of talking about systematic oppression, the idea of talking about class systems, about talking about how artificial those things are, in ways that are accessible to a YA age group of kids, I think is it really speaks to his talent as a kids author, I think, because it can be really hard to take themes like that and condense them in a way that is accessible to younger readers who are starting to develop those moral compasses and those sort of very baby seedling ideas of like political ideology or morality and things like that. And I think that the way he packages these was just so perfect for that, but in a way that is also very I think good for any age reader. Like I can see why this is aimed at like the sort of 12 to 13, 14, 15-year-old audience, so but not dumbed down in the way that I think sometimes, unfortunately, series aimed at kids that age can be. I think he trusts kids that age to be able to handle topics that a lot of other authors wouldn't think that a kid that
Yeah,
age could be reading about and understanding and engaging with. And as well, I just think the titular character, I mean, Bartimaeus is such an iconic character. Like he's just so well written, like as to be like so witty in a way that again I think a 12-year-old would find funny, but an adult would also find funny because it's well constructed. Like the jokes are well put together.
Right.
And just
Those are
it just
very vivid. Yeah.
blows me away how good this series is. And it doubly flabbergasts me that it just didn't blow up in the way other fantasy series at the time were blowing up.
Yeah.
It deserves
I,
better.
I put it up there with Pullman. I think you put it above
Yes.
him, perhaps, but I would
Just
say,
for me personally, I
yeah,
would say they're probably on the same level in terms of
yeah,
like an adult writer writing to a young adult audience, but trusting them to engage with
right.
complex topics.
Very,
Yeah, I
very
would
true.
say.
And I did try to read other books of his, or at least one
Mhm.
other series that I just thought no, I had no interest. It just didn't grab me. I don't know. I don't know why, but either I read that to you guys when you were
Yes.
little, and I thought it was fantastic too. And I have very strong feelings about a lot of stuff we read together.
Yeah,
Um,
I do too. This is the one that I keep coming back to though. I mean, because like there were other series that we read that were in this same sphere. Like we were
yeah,
reading Harry Potter, we were reading the Charlie Bones series, we
yeah,
read like
yeah,
you did, I think, read us the at least the first of his Dark Materials. But for some reason, this is the one that
yeah.
really got me. And I do think that unlike some of those other series, that nostalgia hasn't been as kind to for me. Like looking back, I'm like, oh, actually, maybe those weren't as good as I thought they were when I was a kid. Like they're not as well constructed as I thought they were. This one actually really holds up.
Yeah.
And I think is better even than what I thought it was
Is
as
that
a
an
kid.
advanced reader's copy, or is that the?
Yes,
Okay.
that's why it looks like this. And
Yeah,
it's a pity
it's
because I
cool.
actually think it's a cool cover. But
Yeah.
yeah, it does not look like this normally, but that's just the one I happen to have.
Okay, that's really cool. I just saw a picture of looks like the cover of a newspaper with
Mm,
a Franklin Delano Roosevelt on the front,
hmm.
and I was puzzled, and I think, oh, I think that's actually they're going to use that as the cover, which is very much like that one, which was not the cover of the book when it was
No.
released. Very cool to have
I think it's interesting because if
little
you look at the,
treasure.
yeah, well, because if you look at the covers of the official publication of these, I don't want to say they're misleading because I think they're absolutely accurate because again, I do think that he wrote this for a young adult audience. Like that is who it is for, and that's why the covers correspond to that intended audience. But I think that maybe because of the glut of that type of fantasy coming out at that time for YA audiences, it just got lost in the shuffle, maybe even in part because of those covers being
Yeah,
so somewhat generic YA fantasy cover. I don't know. Because like the Artemis Fowl series had a very iconic stylized cover look. And I
yeah,
think that set those apart. And I think Harry Potter didn't need to have an iconic cover look because everybody was going to read those anyway. But I think that these, unfortunately, not this cover, but like the official publication covers were just too generic somehow to stand out. Maybe I don't know, but
yeah. Well, maybe the future will be kinder, and this will be resurrected.
by me, I will single-handedly go to bat for this series. I recommend it to everyone, and I think anybody. So if we're talking about who we would recommend this to, like I would recommend it to anybody who is a parent of kids that age for sure, because I think it would be it's really enjoyable. I really liked that you read them out loud to us, but I could see like even a parent just giving it to a kid that age who they want to get into reading. The kid is into reading, they like fantasy or they want to get into fantasy. Really good gateway for that. I think like as we've seen, history hasn't been as kind to other YA fantasy series from that era of like the early like late 90s early 2000s, but I
This
think that
book,
this one stands
this
up for
book has
sure.
a good grabber at the beginning too.
Yes.
I mean, the first scene
Oh yeah,
with
of him
Bartimaeus,
summoning
and
Bartimaeus.
then
Yeah.
why he's got Bartimaeus and what happens. Well,
Yeah.
I guess I think the first thing is Bartimaeus and the boy, but
Hmm.
then there's a reflection on why is he doing this because of
Hmm.
something that happened. So I think it's a really good opening.
One of the things that I think in particular, if we're being specific, that I like about this series and why I champion it so hard, beyond the fact that I just happen, I think, to agree with the political leaning that he's discussing in this, is that unlike I think some other series that are written by adults for younger teens, this he allows the character to develop in a way that makes me feel like he actually hung out with kids that age when he was writing this. You know, like the emotional like level of maturity of all of the younger characters feels correct to me, but in a way that's not obnoxious because I think he harnesses it to in service of the plot. Because I think that the entire way the plot gets started feels very immature, but has like wide reaching consequences. So it tracks to me that how old is the kid at in the first one? 12. Like it tracks to me that a 12-year-old would do the things that this kid does and that they should have wide reaching consequences, and they do. Whereas I think a fault of some other series aimed at this age level is that they'll either completely mischaracterize kids that age and they don't feel like they're that young, or they feel younger than they should be, or there's something off about the level of maturity of the characters, or they'll do something that feels like, yeah, that seems like something a 13-year-old would do, but then the consequences just don't seem like they match up with whatever the kid did, you know? Like they're either too severe or not severe enough somehow. But this to me feels very much like the kid had to be 13 for this, or 12 or whatever, for this specific plot to work. And it needed to be set up that way. Because if an adult acted the way this kid does in the first one, that would feel really off. So he has to be that age for this plot to work, I think, which I think also makes it somewhat unique because that kind of continues to be true throughout the other two books, I think. So anyway.
Very good choice. I concur.
And I will talk about it many more times, I'm sure, at the slightest provocation, because I am like the cheerleader for that series.
Okay, my turn.
Yeah.
Let me do one of fiction for a change. You might have thought this was coming. Thomas Wolfe, Look Over an Angel. Very significant book in my life. Who would I recommend it for? I would guess I would say a sensitive high school boy, probably, but I would hope it would transcend that limitation. That's, characterizing myself, so, if that's fair. Let me just read one thing that might grab anybody. It's a poem that he puts at the very beginning of the book, but it's a poem by him. So a little bit, I'll read through it quickly.
Sure.
A stone, a leaf, an unfound door. Of a stone, a leaf, a door, and of all the forgotten faces. Naked and alone, we came into exile. In her dark womb, we did not know our mother's face. From the prison of her flesh, have we come into the unspeakable and incommunicable prison of this earth. Which of us has known his brother? Which of us has looked into his father's heart? Which of us has not remained forever prison pent? Which of us is not forever a stranger and alone? O waste of loss in the hot mazes, lost among bright stars on this most weary, unbright cinder, lost. Remembering speechlessly, we seek the great forgotten language, the lost lane end into heaven, a stone, a leaf, an unfound door. Where? When? O lost and by the wind-grieved ghost, come back again. What I would say is, if it were all like that, it would be awfully hard going, but he's got that kind of a sensitivity and a giant sprawled out story, very long-winded, I guess you could say. But what I thought of to say about him is like, he's very much like Walt Whitman, but with this sad note going on. So anyway, it's a story of a young man, a coming of age of a portrait of the artist as a young man. I took a class one time and we were talking about Joyce, and I said, in an essay I wrote that he was the American James Joyce.
Yeah.
And the teacher said, that's an interesting idea. So he was reading it, and then he just said to the class, who do you think is the American James Joyce? And nobody had any suggestion at all. So, but it's a Bildungsroman, standard artist as a young man kind of thing. And set in South Carolina until the young man grows up and moves on. And Thomas Wolfe himself was a very large guy, like 6'4" or something like that, and bulky. I mean, football player looking or whatever.
Mhm.
And so there's this impression of him like everything's larger than life, and it seems to suit somebody that size. If he's describing a meal or he's describing a scene, it's always like very big and bold, but very poetic. Anyway, I think it's a wonderful novel.
Yeah,
And
I've heard you mention that one a couple times.
yeah,
Yeah.
it was influential in my growing up.
If you don't mind me asking, in what way? Like, did you see yourself in this character, or was it
Yeah,
more like
I
you
guess so.
looked
I
up
guess it
to?
was sort of like identifying with him
Mm,
and feeling a little isolated in my feelings, but he was articulating for me. So that's why I say a sensitive high school boy would
mm,
be the main candidate. But I think it wouldn't be strange for a sensitive high school girl to
mm,
identify with him because, sort of a la Plato, perhaps, or a
mhm,
la Carl Jung or other people, I really think people are both male
mm,
and female. And it's often an artist, a writer has to be able to tap both those to be able to write a story that's outside of just their own one possible way of looking at things.
mhm,
And also for the reader, there's, I just read the novel by Jesmyn Ward,
mm.
the Salvage the Bones. The
Yep.
main character speaking is a girl, and I have no problem identifying with her and her feelings and what happens to her,
Mhm.
along with everything else she's talking about, because I think literature allows us to open up ourselves to that bigger identity that we actually have and are often constrained by society of how we behave and all that. But literature is like a magic world you can go into and be multiple.
Mm,
So I'm saying that in defense of the idea that it wouldn't be odd for a young woman or a girl or a high school girl to discover Thomas Wolfe and find a lot in that. I would
mhm.
like to believe. So,
Yeah, I remember, if I remember, you said of it before as well, that it's one of those books where you feel like it has to hit you in a certain moment of time to be effective in the way you're talking about. Would
pretty
you?
much, but I think um, if you were reading it at the age of that character who grows up in the story, but
Yeah,
by the end he's like college age, let's say, so he's still a very young man.
yeah.
Uh, the ideal reader, if you want to call it that, would be somebody who can not just use the imaginative identification, but feel almost at one with the character.
Mhm,
In that
mhm,
sense, like you were saying about the young adult novel, there's sort of an intended reader, and then there's the fact that anybody could imaginatively participate, even if
mhm,
they're not the intended reader's age or sex or nationality or whatever else was
mhm,
going on. So
mhm,
I would lean on your remarks about the Bartimaeus trilogy having a sort of target audience that might be moved in a way that would be more moved than an adult reading the book would
mhm.
be, but the adult through their imagination can live through the whole story also, if that
It,
makes
it
sense.
is a very interesting, even that as a topic is very interesting. That line, I think, of like who a target audience is for something and why, and like how important that is from the perspective of the artist putting it together, I think. And I guess that's sort of what I was getting at with my criticism of some YA novels and series is that I feel like the ages of the characters in a way are often very arbitrary and in that end somewhat unrealistic, like that whatever's going on either is inappropriately adult for whatever the age of the kids are, in terms of like, oh, this, like, it's a silly example, but like in Yu-Gi-Oh, the idea that like they're all teenagers and like Kaiba is the CEO of this company and he's like
Yeah,
16.
yeah.
is absurd in a sense. Like if you're 16, you might think, yeah, that could be me. But in the grand scheme of things, like, no, that doesn't track. And I think,
Yeah.
unfortunately, a lot of YA stuff kind of falls into that trap of like over-aggrandizing what a teenager is realistically going to experience, could experience, should experience, you know.
Right.
Even something
Yeah.
like The Hunger Games being YA is sort of arbitrary in my opinion. Like there's no
Yeah.
reason that she has to be that age. But I think there's something really commendable about authors who are able to capture something of that experience, even being much older, or maybe even needing to be older to be able to have the 2020 vision to look back at that age and understand what is worth capturing or what's important to capture
That's an
and
interesting
making it
point. Yeah.
integral to the heart of whatever the story is. And it
Yeah.
sounds like that one
Yeah,
does.
that's a good example. That I mean, your point is interesting because it's like you'd say, an, it takes an adult usually to write the book.
Mm-hmm.
Matter if the character is a child, it doesn't mean that the
Yeah.
12-year-old is the ideal person to write the book.
Right.
So yeah, so you're right. The adult has to be able to digest their whole plan
Mm.
and weigh it, presumably with an insight into what that age is like, of why they chose that. Maybe something about themselves. I'm not a big fan of biographical reading of things,
Mm. Mm-hmm.
autobiographical reading, uh, that the author, like, oh, surely this author went to a Catholic school because the character did. You go, well,
Yeah.
it's unlikely, but in my opinion, as a reader and a critic of sorts, it's irrelevant where they came from.
Yeah.
They either got it right or they didn't in the sense of their creation. And however much of themselves they used is not my business.
Yeah, I think it takes a hell of a lot of introspection actually to write, especially YA. For some reason, that one seems picture books, there seems to be a groove. Not to say that all picture book writers are equally good or equally tap into like, oh, what would make sense or be important for a 7-year-old to be reading about. But like that seems like there's more of a flow that's consistently correct for that to me. Whereas with YA, I almost feel like it's because of the immense amount of money that there is in that industry. There's more, to me, it seems like more temptation to take a story that otherwise could have been adults of some age and just age them down for the sake of tapping into that market. And maybe that's cynical, but that's how a lot of that reads to
Yeah.
me somewhat.
Which is really too bad, because if you look at it from a different point of view, you could say, um, children are pretty straightforward,
Mm,
at least superficially, so that you could say, I can see some kids playing in the yard and their interactions and all that stuff, and I think I'm going to write a story, blah blah blah. I
yeah.
mean, it's like they're not hiding who they are
Yeah.
usually. But when you get to teen, early, late before teen and into
Yeah.
teen, those tweens and teens, there's a greater deal of secrecy and internalness. Puberty is going to come up, and you're standing among other people. The fact that you don't just go like whatever, act
Yeah.
silly and nobody cares. Now you're getting judged by other people, so it's a very complicated time, and
Yeah.
um, it takes the right author to get that right.
Yeah, because I think the needle you have to thread, in my humble opinion, the one of the big needles you have to thread there is the fact that teenagers, by and large, I think, having been one myself, think of themselves as pretty much the same as an adult. But the needle you have to thread is that thinking with the unreality of that thinking. And I think that's very hard to do successfully. Because when you have something like the Bartimaeus trilogy, or perhaps the Look Homeward Angel, it's like part of in the Bartimaeus trilogy, and especially the first one, is his hubris of thinking I am an adult
Right.
because I'm so clever and I'm so smart and precocious. But the reality of actually, no, you're 12. You aren't an adult. It doesn't matter that you think you are. you don't have the life experience to and you don't have the life experience to back up your impulses, essentially.
Yeah, yeah.
And you, or the understanding of how complex the world actually is, because the plot is literally just that adult humiliated me, I'm going to steal his thing, and that'll make him look foolish. I mean, that is the plot, which sounds very flimsy, but what's so brilliant about it is that that's so believable that a
Oh yeah.
12-year-old would think of this and think like,
A smart kid, it's the humiliation
yeah,
of a sensitive kid would, could easily result in plotting to get even. You know,
definitely. And
um,
but in a way that they don't really think through the far-reaching consequences, which he does
right,
not, right?
right. Like let's say I'm just stupid off the top of my head,
Yeah.
but like some man bullies a kid about being in his yard or something, and the kid's
Hmm.
humiliated in front of some other people or something. And so the kid thinks, okay, I'm going to get back at this guy. I'm going to scratch his car, and then it turns out he's caught on,
Oh yeah,
uh,
CCTV.
CCTV or whatever. And like he thought of it as like, I feel by doing this, it makes me feel better, like I'm getting even with this guy.
Yeah.
I mean, it's almost like the classic thing of the nun or the teacher says, "Sit down and shut your mouth" or something, and then she
Yeah.
turns and the kid goes, I had to do something to get even. But if it
Yeah.
or you might do something more elaborate or more damaging or
Yeah.
more consequential, as you said.
Well, yeah, and I think that you can go either way with it, right? Like in his story, obviously he follows through. I mean, the entire trilogy is kind of set in motion because of this 12-year-old's impulsive behavior, but being also clever enough to follow through on this impulse that was a very immature one to get back at this guy, right? And like another one, but I think you can go the other direction, because I was going to say another thing I think that's very true of people that age is having a very strong impulse, but also having it be very fleeting, right? Like to
Yeah,
have a very strong feeling about something, but then kind of get over it very quickly because you kind of work it through some other way. Like in Mary Renault's The Persian Boy, the character is the teenager, the main character, and he gets mad at this guy in the army and is kind of jealous of him because of the attention that Alexander the Great pays this other soldier who's his friend, who they're the same age, and this kid is a teenager. And he has in one page of the book, and this felt so correct to me. In the same page, he has this thought of like, I'm gonna poison that guy. I hate that guy. I'm gonna poison him. And he like thinks through in one page how he would do it, where he would get the poison, like all of this. But then by the end of the page, he's like, but I'm not going to.
yeah,
And I'm like, that's so believable to me that
yeah.
you would have that strong feeling about something, emotional response to thing, and then kind of be like, but that's actually too much work, or like, maybe that won't work, or like, oh, never mind.
Actually,
You know?
that's really fascinating. It reminds me of something. I don't know if I'm going to be able to grab it out of my brain, but it's I think it's a Jungian thing.
Mm.
But what it was a Jungian, not Jung, but somebody else
Mm-hmm.
was discussing this idea that Um, God, it was really, I wish I could get the whole thing, but the simple part that fits is symbolic action can be as powerful as actual action. So,
Mm.
meaning, um, you can allow evil into yourself, if you want to call
Mm.
it that, or revenge or whatever, if you limit yourself to a symbolic act, which this kid did basically in that story, or the teenager
Yeah.
character in the what you just said, because he goes through this whole thing in his imagination,
Yes.
and then he's burned up the need to do it.
Yes.
I think that's really terrific.
That scene really stuck with me. I think that was what made me realize how good of a writer she was. Because again, it initially felt sort of inconsequential, the age of this character, but the once I got to that and I started thinking about other things, because she was in her, I think, 50s or even 60s when she wrote it, but
Oh,
she was able to not even just in that scene, but I think overarchingly, to my mind at least, capture very correctly the spirit of a teenager
Yeah. It's
as this
possible.
character.
Certainly, the advantage is having been a teenager, but
Yeah.
now having all this experience. And it also, again, even though I'm treading on that
Hmm.
autobiographical level, if the author's interested in this idea, maybe they're noticing
Yeah.
people of that age now, and they're interested in that
Hmm.
issue, or the life of people of that age
Hmm.
enough to be tuning in to revive the feelings that they also still have.
I think that's essential. I really do. I mean, it's sort of a stock quote as a criticism at this point, but like usually I see this criticism levied at male authors writing women, but the stock criticism is just sort of like, do you even know any women? Like it doesn't seem like you hang out with women, know any
Yeah,
women.
if this is what you think, yeah, yeah,
Yeah, and I think that what we're talking about is almost the diametrically opposed opposite of that, which is like, no, I am not that thing myself, but I pay attention because
yeah,
I find that authenticity of that identity is important to me. And going back to the Look Homeward Angel thing, I think it's interesting that we each picked one that's kind of like that, but it's sort of like on the opposite ends of the teenage spectrum, where it's like either the impulsivity and active, sort of manic active side of that, or the like almost paralysis of introspection that you can have at that age. I feel like those are sort of the poles that a
yeah,
lot of teenagers either kind of bebop between or find themselves stuck on one end or the other.
yeah. That's very, very true.
I definitely think for myself, I've bebopped a little bit, but I feel like from the stories you've told me, you stuck more on that one end.
Yeah. Well, I think I've I just imagine, and looking back at myself, I just think I
Mm,
was always introspective, or like I don't think people would see me as an introvert,
mm,
but I think that is more essentially true.
mm,
Uh, I mean, I had plenty of friends, and I was a comedian and
mm,
type of kid and all this stuff. But I think I have not had very many enduring friendships.
mm,
Any, you know what I mean? So I just think I don't know what it is, but um, actually, I would say a revealing thing about me. Might as well tell
mm.
this to the world. Uh, I think that I'm probably what Jung would describe as a puer aeternus, which is an eternal child or eternal boy.
Mm.
And um, I don't think I matured properly.
Let's.
But it's a thing to be. It's one of
Yeah.
the. I mean, anyway. That's so.
Well, I can say Finn and I, my brother and I, both benefited from that because I think that to large extent, that is probably what led you to some of the choices for things to read to us. I assume because, or even the things we watched, because I feel like a lot of that came down to your taste. And I think that you just had a really good taste when it came to things that you thought we would find engaging, that you were correct about, and also that were good versions of that thing, like there were a few, but like that probably Finn and I picked, but like there were very few, I think, pieces of media that you brought to us that didn't feel thoughtful, but also like correctly aimed at our age group. So maybe that's
Oh,
why, because you felt like it was still kind of aimed at you.
yeah, yeah. We were lucky enough as a family to discover Hayao Miyazaki.
Yeah, well, this is the kind of thing I mean. Like, I think that your interest in anime heavily advised the fact that Finn and I were even exposed to it, obviously, in the first place, to have any interest in that. And I think that it was even more validating that it was brought to us, and the specific ones that you brought to us by through the lens of an adult. Because it's like you didn't, because if it would have been up to us, like we would have just consumed whatever was around us that was aimed at us. But I think that because you were interested in the things that were aimed at kids our age, you could also filter it through the lens of like, is that good or not? Because you had an adult's sensibilities sort of to present to us the things that you thought were
Well,
actually the best of that type of thing.
thank you.
So
That's a very nice compliment.
I appreciate that because I like to think that I maintained a certain level of taste. Maybe I didn't, but at least at a time when I was like 10, I probably had pretty good taste because of that.
Oh,
The next one that I have is completely beside that point. and it's more of a like, if you liked this, you should read that type of thing. This is actually one that I read fairly recently, like I think last year, but it really stayed with me, especially because the one I'll compare it to is so widely considered to be incredibly good. This isn't my pick, but this is the one that I'm going to compare my pick to. So everybody seems to pretty much unanimously agree that Things Fall Apart by Achebe is good. It's excellent, it's top tier, and everybody should read it. And this one that I'll recommend, I would compare it to this for a couple of reasons. And I think it may not be technically just as good, but I think if a person liked this and wanted to explore these themes of like colonialism and masculinity and how they kind of intersected in what happened, and was also very heavily advised by those two things kind of coming together, would also probably like this one, which is In the Castle of My Skin by George Lamming, who is an author from Barbados.
Okay.
And he wrote this when he was a very young man, which I think technically actually technically shows up in the writing. Like you can tell in some places that he's a more immature author when he wrote this, because like there are some issues with pacing that I think a more experienced author wouldn't have. But thematically, it's very similar to When Things Fall, or not When Things Fall Apart, in the sense that it takes place in Barbados at the time at which their colonial legacy is a big issue. Like it's already been established in this book, as opposed to in Things Fall Apart, where it's being established that that's the background plot. This is almost the other side of it, where they're kind of wrestling with how to come out from under a colonial legacy. The protagonist is a young boy, like very young, like maybe 10 years old. And it follows him and his group of friends as they're growing up in Barbados at this time that the country is starting to wrestle with their own identity and wanting independence. But what does that mean exactly? And what their relationship to the white people that are still on the island is a big tension. But it's in the background because, much like To Kill a Mockingbird, because this is through the eyes of these very young kids, a lot of the actual plot points are about them being kids. Like it's things that they do as kids, but the things that are going on around them, and especially as they start to get older, they start to realize too how those things influence them. But what I like about this, beyond just thematically it being, something that's very relevant even now, I think, kind of formerly colonized people wrestling with that legacy of colonialism, but also I think is really cool about this is his descriptions of Barbados are so beautiful, and you can just tell how much he loved this place that he was writing about, especially in the earlier sections of the novel, where the kids are just kind of running around and you get introduced to different places on the island. He makes it so lush and beautiful, but also like he focuses on the imperfect parts of it as well, that especially as a tourist you wouldn't be focusing on this, but as a person who lives there you would notice. So when he talks about them playing on the beach, there's this scene where they're chasing, I think it's crabs or something, and like even though it's very lush, when he zooms in on it you can also see that there's something sort of just like humdrum to these kids about living in a place like this. The way he describes the water and the beaches, he makes it sound like, yes, and of course we're here. Whereas like if you're a visitor, you'd be like, wow, this is stunning. But for them, it's just normal. And I think the way he juggles the fact that he so obviously loves this place with the fact that it is sort of humdrum normal to the kids is really good. There's a speech that one of the kids gives at the end of this, once they're more grown up, and that kid has gone off and actually went to university in the States and has now come back, that I think is worth the price of admission to the book all by itself. He talks about how there's this big contrast between how Black identity developed in the US and how it developed in Barbados. And it's very, very insightful, I think, on George Lamming's part, who I do think did study in the US at one point, I believe. but yeah, and I think that that speech on its own is really, really good. I think if you were a Black reader, it wouldn't be as mind blowing to you because I think it would be like, well, yes, I know that. But I
Right.
think for a white reader, it would be very gravity shifting to understand what he's getting at in the conclusion of this. Anyway, it's very, very, very good. As I say,
I'll be on it.
there are some issues with pacing in the middle uh, that this one doesn't have, but like in any case, I think his writing is strong enough that even in those slower middle sections, it's not like unbearable because you're still interested in the little anecdotes, but I think he could have cut them for the plot, is sort of
Yeah.
what I'm getting at.
How thick is that? How many pages is that?
Um,
400?
no, my copy is just over 303.
Okay. Just curious. It looked kind of thick. I was just curious.
Yeah, it feels thick. That's what I will say. Like it is 300 pages, but it feels like a 400-page novel, I would say, because that section in the middle does carry on a
Okay.
bit. But again, I would when I was reading it, I would kind of pause between what I would consider sort of set pieces in the middle, and that made it feel like it was going a little bit faster because if you try to read it straight through, I think you're going to get lost in the sauce somewhere in the middle of like,
Yeah.
why do I care about this, or like what, how does this connect? It doesn't. There are some things in the middle that don't connect to really anything else. He just wanted to include these little
Yeah.
things
Yeah.
about goings on in the village, but anyway, I highly recommend this, especially if you liked Things Fall Apart, but I think it
Which I
stands on
did
its
very
own
much.
anyway.
I think I read it on your recommendation if I remember right.
Things Fall Apart?
Yeah.
Oh, maybe.
I
I also
I
think
didn't
that's
read that. In fact, I think I told you something you didn't know, which was that
mm.
it's part one of a trilogy.
Yes, I didn't know that.
Yeah, and
I,
I
I
didn't
don't
follow it
understand.
up, but I thought that would have been interesting if I had, and maybe I will sometime. But that other one sounds really, really good. I wrote it down.
I would highly recommend it. And again, it's interesting because since you're talking about Come Home, Look Homeward Angel being a very introspective book,
Yeah.
this one has elements of that in the sense that the protagonist doesn't really talk to you or to anybody. They're just kind of recording what's going on until the very end. That was a choice. I don't think everybody will like that the protagonist is suddenly talking at the end of the novel when he wasn't the entire first 250 pages or whatever, but like I didn't mind. But it is sort of introspective in that sense that the kid is the yeah, just the more introspective one in the group who's kind of the one recording these things going on.
Okay. Just to clarify something, I didn't make it very
Yeah.
clear about Thomas Wolfe.
Oh yeah.
The character is very sensitive,
Mm.
but it's not like he's just sitting around thinking. He does a lot of stuff, and
Oh, okay.
he's but his perceptions are grand. Like
Mm.
as a writer, I mean, the character sees things and says
Mm.
what's there about everything. Like his descriptions are very full
It
in a good
almost
way. I mean,
sounds,
very, you know,
is it somewhat not thematically, obviously, but is it somewhat like Young Torless then? Because he is an active participant in the events of that plot, but a
right.
large swaths of it are him kind of philosophizing about them in his
Yeah.
own mind.
Yeah, I wouldn't call what happens in this one philosophizing. So in that sense,
Mm.
no, but it's he's given the poetry of an adult
Okay.
characters spouting
Yeah,
this.
yeah,
It's
yeah.
like author
No, it's
is
the yeah.
creating the world in which this character is moving around, and
Mm.
it's just very rich and full.
Mm.
And I probably should have thought a little more about what I was going to try to say about it.
No, I mean, I think that's fair. I think that gives me what I wanted to know.
And
And
I haven't
actually,
read it. I probably haven't read it in 50 years or something.
ah, well, but
Maybe
it's
I should read it again, but it's always been in my mind.
and in your heart apparently as well.
Yeah, yeah, very much. Okay, here's
And then do
one.
you have, yeah, I was gonna ask this your turn.
You ready?
Yeah.
Um, the book.
Ooh.
by Alan Watts. It's called The Book on the Taboo Against Knowing Who You Are.
Huh. Okay.
And it's pretty short. It's
Huh.
only 159 pages. He's a kind of a Western advocate of Eastern thought.
Mm.
You
Hmm.
early on, he was kind of around the time of the Beats and that kind of thing.
Mm.
But he was not exactly part of that movement so much. He was actually a Unitarian minister
Oh, really?
by education or something. But then
Huh.
he got completely caught up in Buddhism and is able to communicate it not so much like, wouldn't you like to convert to Buddhism, but simply saying, let's talk about what life is to anybody, you know. And
Mm.
he's really good at finding a perfect analogy when he's trying to make a point, and very clear writer, very clear thinker,
Hmm.
which kind of effortlessly rolls along and makes perfect sense. But he's basically just saying how we get tangled up in complications that don't need to exist, and that if we were more tuned into the present, which is a very, Zen Buddhist kind of thing,
Mm.
we would all be better off. But he says it in such an engaging and comfortable to the Western mind. I actually saw him one time. Mike was a big fan of his too, my brother Mike.
Mm.
And I had a friend who went to Oberlin College in Ohio, and my friend was taking a religion class at Oberlin and told me that Alan Watts was going to talk to the school, and
Huh.
that if I wanted to go, I'd be fine. So I told my brother, and he's going, oh, okay, wow, I got to go. I can't remember if it was just him or not, but Mike and I and my friend Wayne. So Wayne had the inside lane on this whole thing. So Alan Watts spoke to the whole school in a big church building of some kind.
Wow.
Then he went to talk to the private class that Wayne was in, and Mike and I just went along for that. So there's only like 12 people there. And the reason I
Wow.
picked this up is just for an example that Mike remembers very vividly. He mentioned it once not long ago, but how we were sitting around in a circle, and Alan Watts would just say, like he was talking about something, and people were asking him questions, and
Hmm.
very calm, like he's a very calming presence. Like
Hmm.
it's not like that, like high energy, like, okay, that's a good question. Let me tell you about that. He's not like
Hmm.
that, just very quiet, and like a pause between before he would answer. And at one point he just said, why don't we all just close our eyes and think about what you're hearing?
Hmm.
And then it was just really, you could go, well, that anybody could tell you to do that. And you go, well, there's a,
But he did. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. And there's a charisma that people can attach to somebody,
Hmm.
and if it's them because they attached it to that person. Put it down.
I think
I
I
didn't claim
absolutely
that
know.
he's charismatic. I would just
Yeah.
say I imbued this guy with wisdom and insight, and I was repaid by how he how he acted.
Yeah, no, I totally know what you mean because I think if you ask almost anybody about a person that at some point they idolized and you ask them why, whatever the thing is, the message that they got out of that person is probably not new, especially if they were young when they looked up to that person, but that was the person that they got it from. So that's
Right.
significant to them. It sounds like that a little bit.
Yeah, very much.
That's so
And
cool though.
it
Yeah.
wasn't even for me. It wasn't for, um, like this big event of my life forever and ever, so much as it makes a good anecdote about
Mm,
him to tell you that part of it. But his books were very meaningful to me,
mm.
um, as much more or more so probably than one afternoon of him, you know, handling questions. Um, I read, a number of his books, and I mean, he was kind of a wacky character. I've seen videos of him in older age before he
Mm.
died. I think he was coughing a lot. He smoked, which is seems like a stupid thing for a person with his depth of insight to be doing, but you know, people are people. So
Yeah.
anyway, oftentimes people can offer you insights regardless of whether they're good people or not. To give the devil his due on the other side, Eldridge Cleaver, who was a Black Panther, if I remember
Mm.
right, um, said he was in jail, and Alan Watts went to that jail to like talk to the prisoners.
Uh-huh.
And Eldridge Cleaver, he said, he seemed like a used car salesman to me. I love being able to, present the contrary vision
Yeah.
of somebody, but I liked him a lot.
Hmm. Cool.
So,
Well, the last one that I have is not related to that at all and is kind of a
okay.
funny note to end on. It's not one that when I read it, I thought I would think about as much as I do. And it's not that I think about it because I'm like, oh my God, that was so profound, but I think about it a lot in relation to other things that I read now.
Okay.
Um, and I do like it on its own, and I would recommend it to a lot of people anyway. But that's John Gardner's Grendel.
Oh, okay.
Now, hear me out. So, what I really like about this, what it is for the uninitiated, it is essentially what I would consider fan fiction, wherein like Grendel, the monster from Beowulf, is the protagonist, and it's first person from his perspective as the monster from that story. And what I find so interesting and what I continue to think about this is I think that it's a really good book for a person who's interested in literary analysis because the story itself is fairly straightforward, especially if you've read Beowulf. Like he adds a lot of things that predate the Beowulf story. Most of this takes place before Beowulf even happens.
Mm.
And it's about Grendel growing up and experiencing things. And it's very funny, but what's interesting about it is that the perspective or the angle that he takes with this is he makes Grendel very, very likable as a character. Like he's sort of buffoonish a little bit, but he'll have these moments of insight, or other people around him will have interesting moments of insight that kind of go over his head, but you get to be in on. But throughout the whole thing, like he'll do things like he'll trip over things and he's kind of bumbling a little bit and a little bit immature, and but very, very likably so. And there's this expression that I don't know if you're familiar with that's of internet fame called a soft boy. And a soft boy would be like kind of what you were describing the character from Look Homeward Angel as, where it's like it has to be a young man, usually, who's very sensitive and somewhat misunderstood. And there was this era on the internet, specifically on Tumblr, where there were a lot of the girlies who would take characters that were kind of the villains and they would just say, no, they were just a soft boy. They were misunderstood. They were good, actually, and they just needed to be loved.
Okay.
And he kind of in this paints Grendel as that type of character. And I think that's deeply fascinating because he follows through at the end of the story by kind of doing this like role reversal where a flip kind of switches and Grendel is actually very monstrous and does very monstrous things within this story before even the Beowulf stuff, where there's just, it's very hard to overlook it and be like, no, that was fine, actually. But it's in tension with this character that you've come to love. So this character that you really enjoy and think of as kind of the hero, and maybe he was misunderstood and maybe the humans were kind of bad. But then he turns around and does these things that are super inexcusable. And I think that that's very interesting as a reader to have to parse through. And the reason I like this one is because I actually would put it as a companion book with Lolita, because I think Lolita can be read very similarly, where you have this very charismatic villain main character who lulls you into this belief that they are the good guy and that they are totally justified in what they're doing and they're victimized by society and you should feel sorry for them, but then they do very inexcusable things. And in Lolita, the protagonist has a coming to Jesus moment where he in the text recognizes this, like, oh shoot, I'm the pentapod monster actually, whoops. And Grendel sort of has that coming to Jesus moment of like, maybe I am the monster. And I really like that type of story because this stands in opposition to why I hate The Catcher in the Rye, because I don't think that Holden Caulfield has that coming to Jesus moment. where he recognizes that maybe he does things that make him not the good guy as well.
Right.
And I think that that's unfortunate because I would have liked it much better if he would have had that kind of character arc, because I think that's a much better lesson for a reader to take away from something, that you can find a person charming, but you need to be careful that that doesn't it doesn't erase your ability to recognize that maybe they are charming and likable, but that doesn't mean that they're a soft boy, actually.
That's
I really
very
liked this in
interesting.
that. And so
Yeah,
I
very
like
interesting.
this for that reason more than any other. And that's why I think about it. But it's also just a really fun read. And you don't really have to have read Beowulf to read this. In fact, in some ways, it would make it easier to read Beowulf if you read this.
Hmm.
And he is very, very funny. Like Gardner's jokes in this are very good. The characters are very tightly written. And the shenanigans that Grendel gets up to are very like darkly whimsical, and kind of like some of it is a little grotesque, like the scenes of him with his mother are a little grotesque, but in a way that's sort of absurd and still fits the overall feeling of like shenaniganiness that this takes on. It's very fun to read, but also I think very good as a springboard for using to get into literary analysis.
Yeah, that's one I didn't read. I've read quite a few of his books.
Mm,
I like John Gardner. In his nonfiction, he was very much a proponent of, well, he has a book called On Moral Fiction.
that's
And he
interesting.
was, maybe oversimplifying, it's like
Mhm.
he didn't like the um, value free kind of thing that he thought was going on in literature
Mm,
around him. And he was supposedly pointedly trying to have moral impact in the books, in the novels.
that
Um,
shows in this, I
he
think.
was a medievalist.
Hmm.
His own background. Um,
That shows in this too.
yeah, which certainly shows he would know all about the background of that. But
Hmm.
somewhere he claimed that he didn't. He looking back, he didn't. He dismissed that book a little bit on the grounds that he felt he was not successful in integrating the symbolism and things like that.
Hmm.
He thought it was too clear that it was going on. I want to read that book now, especially that you brought it up.
I
It
would
could be,
agree with him that it is, but that's why, in some ways, I think that's the strength of it, that it is somewhat
yeah.
clear.
Other people think it's a really good book of his, whereas he
Yeah.
was trying to be dismissive of it. Maybe
Well,
he
as
just
I say,
wanted
I
more
think there's
readers.
no, yeah, I think there's like less sleight of hand with it thematically, perhaps, than in other books. But I think that that's part of what makes it good, because I think if you are not if you haven't been trained, or you're sort of starting off on that journey of how to understand a text from the inside out, I think it's
Yeah,
a
yeah,
really good place to start, because it is fairly not on the nose, but like you can understand like, oh, this is a symbolism moment. I should pay
right, right,
attention.
right. No, I would like to read it because I do enjoy that kind of thing, and
Yeah.
I'm not bummed out if any of it leaps out at me or something like that. That's fine. Uh,
Yeah.
Something you said reminded me of an interesting issue. A couple of things came up that were strangely related to this. One, I
Hmm.
read an article today in a literary magazine, or a literary
Hmm.
review about television. So strangely enough, they were
Oh.
talking about two books about HBO, and they
Oh.
and the changes that seems to have affected in TV fare. And they were
Mm.
singling out primarily like The Sopranos and something else. And what they were saying is that because of the way that evolved, the writer of this thing, presumably agreeing with people who wrote the two books that he was
Hmm.
analyzing, um, that the complexity of character was allowed to get much deeper. And the example that jumped to my mind when you were talking about Grendel was said it was used for a different purpose in the article, but they were saying Tony, whatever his name is, Soprano. Tony Soprano is the main Soprano. I've never watched
Yeah.
The Sopranos.
No.
I know who that is, the actor and all that.
Hmm.
They said he's very affable and funny, and he's nice and all this. And then it said he was driving somebody somewhere, his kids was driving some kids somewhere to do something. He stops at a gas station. Apparently, this happens in the show.
Hmm.
And he sees a guy at the gas station that he recognizes as somebody who did him dirty in the past, or like,
Hmm.
fingered something and he was involved in. And then they got, the FBI gave them like a new identity kind of a thing.
Hmm.
But he recognized the person and he winds up strangling them to death. And then he gets back in the car or whatever. And he's like, okay, kids, everybody got a drink? Okay. It's like,
Yeah.
they're kind of having it both ways. Like, we really like this guy, and yet he just killed somebody.
Yeah,
And,
I
and
really
that's
like
real. That's
that.
more
Yeah.
real. Whether maybe any of us don't normally kill somebody, but we're certainly not saints. The way you were complaining about Holden Caulfield,
A little
and
bit.
in
I
that
think that
that
Holden Caulfield thinks of himself that way. That's my problem with that book, is that nothing, and maybe somebody will come out of the woodworks and be like, nope, you just didn't read it carefully enough. And I will concede maybe. But like my feeling about that one is that the author, Salinger, sets it up with that setup where it's like, here's this kid who's this complex person who has a very strong moral compass, but nevertheless does some like questionable things. And my problem with that book is that every time I've read it, I've looked and I've really tried to see that click moment where maybe he doesn't recognize this in himself, but there's something that happens where you're meant to recognize this, that maybe he's not a reliable narrator, that maybe he isn't this perfect character that he thinks he is. But I just don't think, for me, to my satisfaction, that Salinger makes that point. And I
yeah,
think that unfortunately, that's why a lot of the people, especially the teenage boys who liked that book,
right.
they think of themselves as this guy and they think, I'm a victim of a bad system and I am, the one who you
All
should feel
good and
sorry for. And that I cannot with that. And I feel like if that many people misread it that way, and I have also read it that way too, that's my problem with that book
yeah,
mostly.
that's a very interesting thing. The other example I was going to use, a very similar question in
Mm-hmm.
I guess. Prince Mishkin is a character in a
Okay.
Dostoevsky novel,
Ooh.
The Idiot.
Okay.
He's the title character,
Mm.
so called, but he's portrayed as an innocent.
Mm.
And it's like Dostoevsky claimed he wanted to portray innocence, you know, and a lot of people go, this guy's just not believable. You know what I mean? It's like,
Yeah.
yes, a writer can do this, but does that mean that they really track as a
Yeah.
rapid portrayal of an actual type of person, or a person could possibly be like that? And that's the
Yeah.
question mark. Is that evil? Um, I was just reading in this other book that I was going to bring up, but we're past
Mm-hmm.
it. Memories, Dreams, and Reflections by Jung.
Okay.
And while I was waiting to talk to you, I was
Mm.
reading this section in here, and he's actually saying some very bizarre things, like saying evil is in the world and we have trouble telling it apart from good, and that's just the way it is. And he uses a great example. He gives some biblical thing, and then he says, well, in more lay terms, it would be conflict of duty, like there's a Dickensian is the name of a TV series, and
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah,
with
you remember you telling
Stephen
me about
Ray plays a detective
that.
there. There's a whole bunch of Dickens characters are all in the story. Well, a woman kills a guy, and this cop has been trying to figure out who killed the guy, and he finally finds that it's this woman, and he's arresting her. And he
Mm-hmm.
actually, sorry, lady, and he even knows what happened, that it wasn't like premeditated or anything, but he's just going like, hey, I'm just an emissary of justice here. So
Mm-hmm.
he drags her all the way down. They go in. She's a very lovely person. He takes her down to the police station. They go in there, and there's all this chaos going on with a bunch of hookers and
Mm-hmm.
hostiles, a lot of women involved actually, but they're yelling and screaming and fighting and
Mm-hmm.
stuff. And he looks at the woman he's just brought in, and then he changes his mind and he takes her back outside and says, go about your business before I change my mind. But it's like, that's a great example of a conflict of duty, not in the sense of duty as told by the law, but
Yeah.
duty as you feel it. Like,
Yeah.
I took this job, I'm a cop, I'm supposed to do this, but I have this other sense of moral ambiguity that's siding with the woman. And it was like I was avoiding that. And then suddenly it slapped me in the face when we saw this other shit going on. I thought, this woman doesn't belong here.
Yeah. Well, it's those kinds of moments in fiction, whether it be television or books, but like I personally I think that's a major through line in a lot of the things that I read and enjoy, especially is I really like the exploration of that. I also in particular I like the exploration of that in a deconstructive sense. Like that's not just presented, but that's the given, right? That people are complicated. But I like that deconstruction of that in a book like Grendel or yeah, or in Lolita, for example, where it's like, okay, let's take a character and kind of build them backwards in the sense of like you're meant to like this person and are they actually worthy of you liking them? Like, does liking them, can you separate that from their actions? Or, and if you can't, or you struggle to do that, what does that kind of indicate about you in the real world? Maybe meditate on that,
Right.
like, because we can acknowledge that I think people can be complicated, but at the end of the day, we still have to decide what acceptable behavior socially is and like where we land on that. Because I know you have a big problem with revenge as a plot device for this very reason, that it's so often justified within the narrative. And in so many narratives is it justified if the good guys are the ones doing it, that it makes it seem like to the audience, I think, largely revenge is acceptable if you're
And
doing it
it's
for
it's
good
a it's a
reasons.
real easy plot organizer.
Yeah.
Sort of like the thing like boy meets girl, boy loses girl, boy gets girl, or some silly
Yeah.
thing like there's a plot, like do a
Yeah.
movie. But it's sort of the same thing. It's sort of like tragedy occurs, the person picks themselves back up, and presumably by getting revenge, it's almost like when people say, I'm so glad that they finally executed that guy on death row. Now I feel closure for my
Yeah.
death of my son. And I'm going, it's almost like you should have gone into therapy to avoid feeling that the only thing that will make this right is if that guy gets
Yeah.
killed. And then somehow I'll feel good now. I'm fine. It's like if you
Yeah, again, it's and especially I think fiction is such a good tool for exploring things like that because it's not real, it's a static thing, and you can like really pin down the implications of the suggestions of things like that. Like revenge is okay. Let's
right,
explore that and really pin down what we think
right,
the consequences for that starting point are, and
right.
I almost want to say as in a sense that maybe this should spill over into our next podcast episode because I know this is something we both have a lot to say about, but like that question, I think, a la what you were saying about John Gardner of like morality in fiction.
Yeah.
I think that if you're cool with that, I would like that to be our next topic because I
Okay.
think we can
That's a
take
very
that any way you want
okay.
and maybe think of a couple of examples of that we could, or even extend some of these examples as well, because I really like that topic.
That's very interesting. Okay. That'll be something, a project to work on.
Yeah,
Morality in fiction. Very cool. Very
yeah.
good.
And on that note, I think we can probably say we've prattled on about this ad nauseum. Well, maybe not ad nauseum. I could go on, but like for the sake of our audience. So yeah, thank you for that. I think that's a really good, actually, like a springboard perhaps for like another episode. But I really like the examples that you gave of the different book ideas you had. I think that was really an interesting range that you brought to the table. So thank you. I love that we started with the dictionary. I think that was a correct starting point.
I've got George Lamming's name written down here
Mhm.
to look into it. I'm only in the shallow end of the Strudelhoff steps. So it's going to be a while before I read anything else, I think.
Oh gosh.
But
Well, you're in the
I have to do
opposite
some
place.
thinking about a podcast.
I'm in the opposite problem. I'm in the middle of 4 books and I need to finish at least 3 of them before Sunday because I don't want them hanging over my head while I'm on
Wow.
vacation.
Okay. Wow.
That's what I'll be off to do. So,
Okay.
well, thank you for if you made it to the end of today's little garden of rambling
Yeah.
about book things. Hopefully you found some recommendations.
Very, very
I know I'm
intriguing
going to check out Look
discussion.
Homeward Angel, I think.
Very good discussion. And so you're off on your trip this Sunday?
Yep.
Well, keep keep Kendrick close and enjoy yourselves.
Yes, thank you. And for everybody else, we will see you next month and we'll talk about morals in fiction. And I'm sure
Okay.
that'll go off the rails
Well,
somewhere,
that's a
but
great
it'll
topic.
hopefully be interesting.
Good insight to use that as a
Yeah.
topic.
So we'll see you guys next time.
Hey,
Take care. Read some good books, maybe some of these, or maybe they sounded horrible and you can cross them off your list. But either way, hopefully that was insightful. And we'll
yep.
see you guys next time.
Uh,
Bye.
love you. Bye bye.